I raised the money that saved that company twice, and my own son tried to have me declared unfit to manage a checking account. He didn't know that the woman he thought he was signing over to a nursing home still held the one signature that could shut down everything he was trying to build on my name. My name is Eleanor Marsh. I am 66 years old. For most of the people who know me in Asheville, North Carolina, I am the woman who volunteers at the public library on Tuesday afternoons, who grows tomatoes badly and dahlias well, who drives a 12-year-old Honda with a dent in the back bumper that I have never bothered to fix. Nobody who watches me carry my own groceries in from the car would guess that I hold the controlling shares in a pharmaceutical company worth several $100 million, or that the company's headquarters, 6 miles from my cottage, still has my husband's name etched into the cornerstone. I like it that way. I have always liked it that way. This is the story of the year my son decided my quiet life meant I was weak, and what happened when he found out how wrong he was. My husband Thomas and I started what became Marsh Whitcomb Pharmaceuticals in the back room of a compounding pharmacy in 1986. I was the one who kept the books in the early years, who learned to read a balance sheet the way other women my age learned to can tomatoes, out of necessity, because somebody had to, and Thomas was better with the chemistry than with the numbers. We grew slowly and honestly. By the time we sold the manufacturing side of the business into a larger holding structure in the early 2000s, we had kept controlling interest through a family trust, and that trust has held 62% of the voting shares ever since. Thomas served as chairman until his heart gave out 4 years ago, in April, during an argument at our kitchen table about our son's restaurant debts. I have never told anyone that detail. I have carried it the way you carry a stone in your shoe that you have decided not to stop and remove, because stopping to remove it would mean admitting how much it hurts to walk. After Thomas died, I stepped back from any public role at the company. I remained chair of the family trust and I kept my seat on the board, but I let our longtime chief executive, a careful and decent man named Arthur Ligotti, run the daily business, and I let the world assume that Eleanor Marsh was simply an old man's widow living quietly on his pension. I did nothing to correct that impression. It has always served me better to be underestimated than admired. We had one child. Ethan was 40 years old the summer this story begins, married to a kind, watchful woman named Priya, father to 2 children I loved without complication, which was more than I could say about how I loved their father. Ethan had opened 3 restaurants in 12 years. All 3 had failed. He had gone through 2 rounds of what he called bridge financing from investors who were, in fact, money I gave him as loans that were never repaid and that I stopped mentioning because mentioning them only made the visits shorter. I had allowed this pattern for a decade. That is my failing in this story, and I want to say it plainly before I say anything else. I loved my son more carefully than I loved myself, and I let that love become a kind of blindness that cost me more than money in the end. The trouble that this story is actually about began on a Sunday afternoon in late April, when Ethan came to my cottage alone, without Priya or the children, carrying a leather folder I did not recognize. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where his father's heart had stopped 4 years earlier, and for a moment before he spoke, I found myself doing what I had done every single time he visited since Thomas died. I catalogued him. The way you might walk a job site checking for hairline cracks before they become something worse. He looked tired around the eyes in a way that makeup could not have hidden even if men wore it, and his hands, when he set the folder down, moved just slightly too fast, the way hands move when a person has rehearsed a gesture until it stopped looking natural. "You look thin, Ethan," I said. "Are you eating?" "I'm fine, Mom." "Busy?" "Good busy." He smiled, and it was a smile I recognized from every visit for the last 2 years, warm on the surface and hollow half an inch beneath it. "I actually wanted to talk to you about something important today." "All right." I poured him tea he had not asked for, Because it gave me something to do with my hands while I watched his face. What kind of important? I need you to sign some paperwork. What kind of paperwork? Nothing complicated. It's a healthcare directive. Standard stuff for someone your age. If anything ever happened to you, I don't want Priya and me arguing with hospitals about who gets to make decisions. I looked at him for a long moment. My son has his father's jaw and his father's habit of not quite meeting your eyes when he is asking for something he already suspects you will refuse. Standard stuff, I repeated. That's right. Then it won't take Frank long to look it over. Something crossed his face, fast, there and gone, the particular flicker of a man whose plan did not survive first contact with a mother who has read enough contracts to know that the word standard is the first word you use when you are hoping nobody reads closely. It's really not necessary to involve a lawyer for something this routine, Mom. Frank's going to charge you for reading 4 pages you don't need charged for. I have never once minded paying Frank, I said, and I kept my voice light, almost teasing, the voice I had used with him since he was small, and I wanted him to believe an argument was actually a game. Leave it with me. I'll have him look at it, and if it's as simple as you say, you'll have it back signed by Friday. Mom. His voice had an edge now, thin and sharpened, one I had not heard directed at me in a very long time. I'm asking you to trust me. It would mean a lot if you'd just sign it today, while I'm here, so I don't have to drive back out. And here is the part of this story I am least proud of. Some part of me, the part that still remembered a boy painting a fence and getting frosting on his face at 7 birthdays and crying in my arms after his father's funeral, wanted to give him what he was asking for simply because he was asking, simply because refusing had felt, in that moment, like one more small cruelty added onto a lifetime of small cruelties I had already convinced myself I owed him for not being a better mother, a richer mother, a mother who had somehow prevented 3 restaurants from failing. I actually reached for the folder. My hand was an inch from it before I stopped myself. I want you to understand that hesitation, because it matters later. It is the reason everything that followed took the shape it did. I love you, I said, and I meant it completely, and because I love you, I am not going to sign something I haven't read, and neither should you have asked me to. Leave it with me. I set the folder on the counter without opening it, and I made us both tea, and we talked about the children instead, and Ethan left an hour later without the folder and without, I noticed, much warmth in his goodbye. I did not open that folder myself until he had been gone 20 minutes. I sat at the kitchen table and read 4 pages of dense legal language that had nothing to do with hospitals. It was a durable power of attorney, broad enough to give Ethan authority over my financial accounts, my property, and, buried in a clause on the 3rd page, my voting rights as trustee of the Marsh Family Trust, exercisable the moment 2 physicians of his choosing certified that I showed, in the document's own words, any diminished capacity for sound judgment. I sat very still for a long time after I read that clause. Then I picked up the phone and called Frank Delacroix, the attorney who had drafted our trust documents 20 years earlier and who still, at 71, kept an office 2 blocks from the courthouse because he said retirement sounded like a slow death and he preferred the fast kind eventually. Thank you very much. He brought it here himself, I told Frank. He wanted my signature today, no witness present but him. Frank was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Eleanor, I want you to think carefully. Has Ethan asked you for money recently? Has he mentioned any business trouble? Not in the last 6 months. Which is unusual for him. That's not a comfort, Frank said. That's the opposite of a comfort. Bring me the document. Don't sign anything. Don't discuss it with him again until we've talked. Frank, you're frightening me a little. Good, he said, not unkindly. I'd rather you were a little frightened now than badly hurt later. That's not me being dramatic, Eleanor. In 30 years of practicing law, I have seen exactly this kind of document arrive at exactly this kind of family gathering more times than I care to count, and it is never, not once, actually about a hospital. Frank. I heard my own voice catch slightly, and I hated it. He's my son. I know that, Frank said, more gently. I've known that boy since he was in diapers, Eleanor. I'm not asking you to stop loving him. I'm asking you to let me read 4 pages before you hand him control of everything you and Thomas spent 40 years building. That's not a betrayal of him. That's just prudence. I did not know, that Sunday afternoon, how far my son had already gone, or how little time we actually had. I only knew that something in my chest had gone cold and very quiet, the particular stillness that comes when you finally stop pretending you haven't noticed what you have, in fact, been noticing for months. I drove out to the cemetery the next morning, before the library opened, and sat for a long while on the low stone bench beside Thomas's grave, the folder still sitting on my kitchen counter where I had left it. I had not visited in 3 weeks, which was unusual for me, and I think some part of me had been avoiding it, because I did not yet know how to tell him what our son had become without also admitting what I had allowed him to become. I don't know what to do, I said out loud, feeling foolish and not caring, because there was no one to hear me but the mockingbirds and the groundskeeper 2 rows over. You always said I was better at reading people than you were. I don't feel very good at it this morning. I thought about the argument that had stopped his heart, for years earlier, at our own kitchen table. Ethan had called that afternoon asking for $60,000 to cover payroll at the second restaurant, the one on Marymount Avenue, and Thomas, who rarely raised his voice about anything, had raised it that day, had said something I had never quite been able to forget, that we were not going to spend our retirement bailing out a business that had already failed twice before it opened its doors a 3rd time. I had argued the other side. I had said Ethan was our son, that family helps family, that surely once more wouldn't hurt. Thomas had gone quiet, the particular quiet that I now understand, looking back, was not agreement but simply exhaustion, and 20 minutes later he was on the kitchen floor and nothing I did brought him back. I had given Ethan the $60,000 anyway, 3 days after the funeral, because I could not bear, in my grief, to have the last thing his father and I disagreed about be the reason our son's restaurant failed. I have never told anyone that either, until now. I have wondered many times since whether Thomas would have lived longer if I had simply told our son no, that day, the way his father wanted me to, or whether I would only have traded one kind of grief for another, a lifetime of wondering what might have happened if I had refused him even once. I did not find an answer on that stone bench, that morning. I found only the same cold, quiet clarity I had felt reading the folder the night before, and the understanding that whatever I decided to do next, I could no longer decide it out of guilt over an argument that had already cost me everything it was going to cost me. I owed my son honesty. I did not owe him my own destruction in exchange for it. I want to tell you honestly that I did not confront him. I did not call him back that evening and demand an explanation. I have never believed that the person who reacts first wins. I believe the person who understands the whole situation before they move wins, and so for the next several weeks, I did something that would have looked, to anyone watching, like nothing at all. I watched. Priya called me on a Wednesday in early May, ostensibly to ask if I could take the children for the weekend while she and Ethan attended what she called a business dinner in Charlotte. I said yes, of course, and then, because I have known Priya for 12 years and because something in her voice sounded thinner than usual, I asked her how she was doing. There was a pause on the line long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "I'm fine," she said, in the voice people use when they have decided that saying anything else would cost more than they can currently afford. "Ethan's been stressed about the new venture." "What new venture?" Another pause. "He didn't mention it to you?" He's been talking to a group about opening a distribution business. Medical supplies, I think. He said it was going to solve everything. Solve what, exactly? I don't really know, Priya said, and I heard, underneath the words, the particular exhaustion of a woman who has learned not to ask too many questions about her husband's business, because the answers have stopped making her feel better. He gets angry when I ask for details. He says I'm supposed to trust him. I do trust him, Eleanor. I just wish trusting him didn't feel so much like waiting for a storm. Has he asked you to sign anything lately? Anything at all? No, she said, too quickly, and I filed that quickness away the way I used to file away a supplier's too quick answer about a shipment date, back when Thomas and I ran everything ourselves and learned to hear the shape of a lie before we could name it. I thanked her, told her I would love to have the children, and hung up the phone with my hand shaking very slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the cold clarity of understanding that whatever my son was building, he intended to build it using something that belonged to me. Medical supplies. Distribution. My son, who had never worked a single day inside Marsh Whitcomb, who had turned down my quiet offer of an entry-level position 8 years earlier because, in his words, he didn't want to spend his life being known as Eleanor's son, was suddenly talking about a medical distribution venture within weeks of trying to get broad financial power of attorney over me. I called Frank again that night. I think he's planning to use the company somehow, I said. Or the trust. I don't know which yet. Then you find out, Frank said. Quietly. Eleanor, I need you to understand something. If your son is planning what I think he might be planning, the worst thing you can do right now is let him know you're paying attention. Keep being exactly who he thinks you are. Let him keep believing it. And who does he think I am? Frank's voice, when it came, was gentle in a way that still managed to hurt. He thinks you're an old woman in a small house who signs what her son puts in front of her because she loves him and doesn't want to make things difficult. He is about to learn that isn't who you are at all. But he has to be the one to find that out, at the moment we choose. Not before. I did not sleep well that night, or for many nights after. I lay awake beside the empty half of the bed that had been Thomas's, and I asked the ceiling questions I had no one else to ask. Had I made him this way, by paying for every mistake instead of letting a single one land on him the way it should have? Had the stone in my shoe, the guilt over the argument that stopped his father's heart, made me so afraid of losing him too that I had simply handed him whatever he wanted for 4 straight years, and taught him, without meaning to, that I could always be asked for more? I did not have an answer that night. I am not certain I have one now. But I understood what Frank was telling me, because it was the same lesson I had learned building a company from a backroom 40 years earlier. You do not show your hand before you understand the whole table. You watch. You gather. You wait for the moment when the other player is so confident in their own strength that they stop paying attention to yours. The first real piece of the picture arrived 3 weeks later, from a source I had not expected. My nephew Caleb, my late sister's son, had worked for 11 years as a forensic accountant for a firm in Charlotte that specialized in exactly the kind of thing I now suspected I needed. Caleb had always been close to me in the particular way that children of difficult families sometimes attach themselves to the one relative who never asked anything of them. I called him on a Thursday evening and told him, without dramatics, that I needed his professional help with something involving Ethan, and that I needed it done quietly. Send me whatever you have, Caleb said, and give me 2 weeks. What he found took considerably less than 2 weeks. He called me back on a Tuesday, his voice careful in the way that told me before the words did that this was not going to be a short conversation. Aunt Eleanor. I need you to sit down. I'm already sitting, Caleb. Tell me. Ethan has formed a company. Meridian Health Distribution, registered as an LLC in Delaware 4 months ago. He's the sole managing member, no other officers listed. In the past 6 weeks, he's approached 3 suppliers claiming Meridian has a distribution agreement in principle with Marsh Whitcomb Pharmaceuticals. One of them, a packaging outfit in Georgia called Ridgeline Solutions, extended him 60 days of trade credit worth $210,000 based on that claim. My hand tightened around the phone. There is no such agreement. There has never been any such agreement. I know that. You know that. Ridgeline does not know that yet. How does a packaging company extend $210,000 of credit on a claim like that? Don't they verify anything? They verified it, Aunt Eleanor. That's the part you're not going to like. Caleb paused. He forwarded them a letter, on Marsh Whitcomb letterhead, describing a preliminary distribution partnership between the company and Meridian. Signed by you, as chair of the family trust. The kitchen seemed very quiet then. Outside, a mockingbird was working through its repertoire in the dogwood tree Thomas had planted the year we bought the cottage, and I remember thinking, with the strange sideways clarity that shock sometimes produces, that the bird did not know or care that my son had forged my signature to defraud a stranger in Georgia. That's not my signature, I said. I didn't think it was. I compared it against 6 samples from trust documents. It's close, Aunt Eleanor. Close enough to fool a credit department that's looking at a scanned PDF for 10 seconds. Not close enough to fool someone who's actually looking for the differences. Pressure's wrong in the downstroke. The capital E doesn't close the same way twice. Someone practiced my signature. Someone practiced your signature, Caleb agreed quietly. There's more, and I want you to brace yourself for this part, too. I pulled Meridian's incorporation filing and cross-referenced the registered agent. The same agent handles a company called Belhaven Capital Partners, out of Reno, Nevada. Belhaven isn't a licensed lender in North Carolina. It's the kind of outfit that makes short-term loans to people who can't get credit anywhere legitimate, at interest structures that would be illegal here if the loan had originated here. I found the note. Ethan borrowed $290,000 from Belhaven 8 months ago. With the way they've structured the interest, his current balance is north of $380,000, and it's compounding. $380,000. My son, who had once called me from a restaurant supply auction in Knoxville to ask, almost proudly, whether I thought a used walk-in freezer for $11,000 was a good deal, owed nearly $400,000 to a predatory lender in Nevada, and had responded to that debt not by coming to me honestly, the way he always had before, but by forging my name to defraud a supplier and drafting a power of attorney designed to give him control over a company worth more than either of us could easily count. Why not just ask me, I said, mostly to myself. I would have helped him. I always have. That's the whole problem, isn't it? I always have. Maybe that's exactly why he didn't ask this time, Caleb said, gentler now. Maybe he needed this to be his, not another bailout from his mother. Or maybe he's already asked you for so much over the years that he genuinely couldn't stand to ask again and hear himself say the number out loud. I don't know his reasons, Aunt Eleanor. I only know what the documents say. Keep going, I said. Everything you find, keep it. Dates, timestamps, anything that would hold up. But Caleb, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Do not speak to Ethan. Not one word, not a text, nothing that would let him know you're looking. If he finds out before we're ready, I think he'll simply go faster instead of stopping. I need to understand the whole shape of this before he understands that I've seen any of it. You have my word, Caleb said. For what it's worth, Aunt Eleanor, I'm sorry. I know this isn't just numbers on a page to you. No, I agreed. It isn't. Caleb drove up from Charlotte that Saturday, uninvited by anyone but himself, and sat across my kitchen table with his laptop open and a stack of printed exhibits arranged with the same careful precision I remembered from watching him organize his mother's estate papers after my sister died. He was 34 that summer, unmarried, quiet in the particular way of a man who had spent his whole career finding other people's lies inside spreadsheets and had never quite learned how to soften the delivery when the lies belonged to family. "I wanted to show you this in person," he said, "because I don't think it's fair to make you absorb it over the phone a second time. You could have called." "I could have. I didn't want to." He turned the laptop toward me. "This is the wire transfer trail on the Belhaven loan. $290,000, deposited into an account in Ethan's name at a bank here in Asheville. 11 days later, $60,000 of it moves to a poker club membership fee in Charlotte. I want to be careful here, Aunt Eleanor, because I don't want to overstate what I actually know. But I've seen 4 separate transfers over the last year to the same entity, an LLC that operates as a private card room. I'm not a gambling counselor. I can't tell you what's happening in his head. I can only tell you what the money did." I sat with that for a moment, my hands flat on the table the way they had been flat on so many tables that summer. He was gambling. I believe so. Not recreationally. The pattern looks like someone trying to win his way back to even, over and over, and losing more each time he tries. Caleb's voice softened slightly. "I looked at the 2 restaurant closures before this one too, while I was in the records. The second one, the one on Merrimon, had a payroll shortfall 11 weeks before it closed that doesn't line up with the reported revenue. I think there may have been money leaving that business for the same reason, years before Meridian ever existed." I thought of Thomas at that kitchen table, for years dead, refusing $60,000 for a payroll shortfall that may never have been what it claimed to be. I felt something in my chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief but sat somewhere uncomfortably between the two, a feeling I did not have a clean word for even now. "Does Priya know any of this?" I asked. "I don't know what Priya knows," Caleb said. "That's not something the bank records tell me." "All right." I straightened in my chair, because sitting with the ache of it would not help anyone, least of all Priya or the 2 children who called me Grandma L. "Keep working. And Caleb, thank you for driving up." "You didn't have to. You're the only person in this family who ever called me on my birthday every single year without being reminded," he said, closing the laptop gently. "I don't forget things like that either." I sat alone at my kitchen table until well past midnight, and I let myself feel, finally, the full weight of what I had learned. Not anger, not yet. Something colder and more patient than anger, the particular grief of a mother discovering that the child she protected past the point of wisdom had grown into someone capable of using her own name as a weapon against strangers, and, I suspected, was not finished yet. I was right that he was not finished, and I was also about to learn that I had underestimated how quickly a desperate man moves once he believes he has already been discovered. The following week, Priya called me again, this time in the middle of the day, her voice pitched low the way people speak when they do not want to be overheard in their own home. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Of course." "Has Ethan talked to you about the lake cabin?" My chest tightened. The cabin on Beaver Lake had belonged to my mother, and to her mother before that, 40 acres of shoreline and pine forest that had never once, in 3 generations, been divided, sold, or mortgaged. It had come to me outright, outside the trust, a piece of family history that existed entirely separate from the company Thomas and I had built. It was, in every practical sense, the one thing I owned that Ethan could theoretically inherit and sell without touching a single share of Marsh Whitcomb stock. "No," I said carefully. "He hasn't mentioned it." "Why do you ask?" I found a business card in his jacket pocket last week. A real estate broker named Vance Kessler. I looked him up. He specializes in off-market lake property sales, mostly to development groups that don't want their names attached to anything until closing. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I found a folder on our shared computer labeled Beaver Lake Parcel, with photographs of the cabin. Photographs I know Ethan took himself, because I recognized the angle from the dock. The one where you can see the whole shoreline. I closed my eyes briefly. Priya, has Ethan asked you to sign anything recently? Anything involving finances, or property, or my name? The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I understood the answer before she gave it. 3 weeks ago, she said, her voice very quiet now. He asked me to co-sign a home equity loan against our house. He said it was for the new business, something about needing to show liquidity to a partner. I signed it because he told me it was temporary, that Meridian would be generating revenue within 60 days and we'd pay it off immediately. A pause. Eleanor, how much do you think he owes? Because the number on that loan paperwork was larger than I expected. $200,000. I did the arithmetic instantly, the way I had done arithmetic instinctively since I was a young woman keeping books by hand in the back of a pharmacy. 200,000 from their house. 380,000, and climbing, from Belhaven Capital in Nevada. 210,000 in credit fraudulently obtained from Ridgeline using my forged signature. My son was drowning in debt approaching $1 million, and every direction he turned to solve it involved either defrauding a stranger, endangering his own wife's home, or attempting to seize control of a company that had taken his parents 40 years to build. Priya, I said, and I chose my next words with great care, because I did not yet know how much I could trust her, whether her loyalty in this moment belonged to her husband or to the truth. I need you to listen to me very carefully. I don't believe Ethan has told you the full extent of what's happening. I think he's in more trouble than you know, and I think some of what he's done to get out of it may not be legal. I am not telling you this to turn you against your husband. I am telling you because I think you and your children deserve to be protected from whatever happens next. There was a long silence, and then Priya said something I have thought about many times since. I've known something was wrong for months, Eleanor. I kept telling myself it was stress, that it would pass, that I was imagining things. I think some part of me has been waiting for someone else to say it out loud, because I was too scared to say it myself. Her voice caught. What do you need me to do? For now, I said, nothing that would put you at risk. Just tell me if he asks you to sign anything else. Keep anything he gives you, even if he tells you it's routine. I will, she said. And then, quieter, Eleanor, I'm scared. I know, I said. So am I. But being scared and doing nothing are two different things, and I don't intend to let us confuse them. After we hung up, I sat with my tea going cold in front of me and understood that I had just acquired something I had not expected. Not merely evidence, but an ally inside my son's own house, a woman whose eyes had finally opened, and who had chosen, in the moment it mattered, to look toward the truth instead of away from it. I called Frank the next morning and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, the way he always had, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment before he spoke. Eleanor, what you're describing isn't just a family dispute anymore. Forgery, wire fraud potentially, an attempt to obtain guardianship or power of attorney under false pretenses. This is criminal conduct on multiple fronts. I want to bring in someone with real experience in elder financial exploitation cases. There's an attorney in Charlotte, Regina Okafor, who has handled cases exactly like this. I'd like your permission to call her. I gave it. 2 days later, I sat in Regina Okafor's office on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back severely and the stillness of someone who has heard every variety of family betrayal there is and has stopped being surprised by any of them. She listened to Frank's summary, reviewed the documents Caleb had gathered, and then set down her pen and looked at me directly. "Mrs. Marsh, I want to be very clear about something before we go any further. What your son has done, if the evidence holds up the way it appears to, exposes him to serious criminal liability. Forgery under North Carolina law. Potentially wire fraud under federal statute, if any of these fraudulent communications crossed state lines electronically, which given the Georgia supplier and the Nevada lender, they almost certainly did. And if he proceeds with any attempt to use a power of attorney obtained without your informed consent, or attempts to force a competency evaluation to seize your position as trustee, that opens him to charges of elder financial exploitation, which North Carolina prosecutes seriously, particularly when the amounts involved are this significant. I don't want him to go to prison," I said, and I meant it, even as I understood, with a clarity that felt like grief settling permanently into my chest, that the choice might not ultimately be mine to make. "I understand," Regina said, not unkindly. "But I want you to understand something too. Every day we wait, he is likely to go further, not less far. Men in this position rarely stop and reconsider. They escalate, because stopping means admitting what they've already done, and very few people are capable of that kind of honesty once they've gone this deep. So what do we do? First, Regina said, we make sure nothing he attempts actually succeeds. I'm filing an emergency motion this week, quietly, to place a protective flag on the trust's voting authority and on the deed to the lake property, which will require judicial notice before any transfer or amendment can proceed. This won't alert him immediately, but it will stop anything from moving forward without our knowledge. Second, we continue building the record. Third, we let him keep believing he is winning. Overconfident people make mistakes. We want him confident enough to make his next move where we can see it clearly. All right, I said. We wait. But not forever. Not forever, Regina agreed. Just long enough. Can I ask you something, I said, before we stood to leave. You do this often. Families like mine. Does it ever stop surprising you, what people do to each other over money? Regina considered the question longer than I expected. It stops surprising me that it happens, she said finally. It never stops surprising me who it happens to. I've represented women who were genuinely frail, genuinely being taken advantage of because they couldn't fight back. I've represented women like you, Mrs. Marsh, who are nothing of the kind, and who get underestimated precisely because the person exploiting them assumes frailty where none exists. The second kind of case is, I'll admit, more satisfying to win. There's a particular kind of justice in watching someone's whole plan fail because they never bothered to actually look at who they were up against. He's still my son, I said. I don't know how to want him to lose and still love him at the same time. I don't know if those two things are supposed to fit together. They're not supposed to fit together easily, Regina said. They're supposed to sit uncomfortably next to each other for a long time, and you carry both anyway, because that's what it means to be someone's mother even after they've stopped deserving the easy parts of it. I'm not going to tell you that gets simpler. I've watched a lot of clients go through this, and the ones who do best are the ones who stop expecting it to feel clean. That's not very comforting, I said. No, she agreed, almost smiling. But it's true, and I find my clients generally prefer that to comfort, once they've had time to sit with it. I want to tell you that the plan unfolded exactly the way Regina described it that afternoon, clean and controlled from beginning to end. It did not. I have thought a great deal, in the time since, about how easy it is to believe you have accounted for everything, when in fact you have only accounted for what you already know to look for. The complication arrived 9 days later, and it arrived because of a mistake that was entirely mine. I had gone to my regular Thursday appointment with Dr. Patricia Vance, my physician of 11 years, for what should have been an ordinary review of my blood pressure medication. I had not slept properly in over a week by then, and it showed. Dr. Vance took my pressure twice, frowned at the second reading, and sat down across from me instead of standing near the door the way she usually did when an appointment was running short. "Eleanor, that's the highest I've seen you in 3 years," she said. "Are you under some kind of stress I don't know about?" "It's been a difficult month," I said, which was, I told myself, true and not untrue. Difficult how? I meant to say something vague, something about the garden or the heat or a plumbing problem, the kind of small complaint that satisfies a physician without inviting further questions. Instead, exhausted in a way I had not let myself be exhausted in front of anyone since Thomas died, I heard myself say, "My son and I are in a serious disagreement over some financial matters. I'm concerned he may try to have my competency questioned." Dr. Vance's eyebrows rose slightly. "Questioned by whom?" "A judge, possibly." "I don't want to go into the details, Patricia. I only mention it because I imagine it explains the blood pressure better than the salt in my diet does." "I'm sure it does," she said, setting down her pen for a moment. "For what it's worth, Eleanor, you've never once come in here looking anything but perfectly clear-headed in 11 years. Whatever's going on with your family, that hasn't changed today either." She made a note, and moved on to my medication refills, and I left 20 minutes later believing, in my exhaustion, that I had said nothing that mattered, a small true thing shared with a woman I had trusted with my health for 11 years, nothing more. I did not know, walking out to my car that afternoon, that Dr. Vance's practice shared an administrative scheduling system with several other physicians in the region, or that a scheduling coordinator, meaning no harm at all, would mention to a colleague later that week that an Eleanor Marsh had come in discussing a possible competency dispute with her son, small talk between two women filling out the slow hour before lunch. I did not know that the colleague happened to sit on a hospital ethics committee with a physician named Aaron Petroselli, or that Dr. Petroselli had, that same week, been fielding quiet calls from a man named Ethan Marsh asking general questions about how a preliminary competency evaluation might be arranged for an aging parent. Ethan found out, within 4 days, that his mother was already aware of what he was building, and already speaking to attorneys. He did not call me. He did not confront me. Instead, on the following Monday, Regina received an urgent notice from the county courthouse. Ethan, through the disbarred adjacent, fast-moving attorney he had retained on a rush basis, a man named Curtis Boyle whose own disciplinary record Regina would later describe as, in her words, deeply unflattering, had filed an emergency ex parte petition for a temporary guardianship over my person and estate, citing what the petition called sudden and escalating signs of cognitive decline, corroborated, the filing claimed, by a preliminary evaluation from Dr. Petroselli. A hearing had already been scheduled. 2 days out. Regina called me herself, and for the first time since I had met her, I heard something in her voice that was not entirely composed. "Eleanor, I'm not going to pretend this isn't serious." He moved faster than I expected, and I believe he moved because something alerted him that we were already active. "I need you to think very carefully. Has anyone outside of Frank, Caleb, Priya, and myself learned anything about this in the last 2 weeks?" I sat with the phone against my ear and felt something cold drop through my chest as I understood exactly what I had done. "Dr. Vance," I said. I told her I was under family stress. I mentioned a disagreement over financial matters and a concern about competency. "I didn't think." "It's all right," Regina said, though her voice told me it was not entirely all right. "It's done, and we deal with what's in front of us now, not what should have been avoided. Listen to me carefully. An emergency ex parte hearing on a petition like this is decided quickly, often based on limited evidence, specifically because it's designed to protect someone who might genuinely be in danger. Judges take these seriously precisely because sometimes they're legitimate. We are not walking into a hearing where the burden is on Ethan to prove his case beyond doubt. In an emergency setting, the burden can shift uncomfortably close to us having to prove there's nothing wrong with you, on 2 days' notice, in front of a judge who has never met either of us. "What happens if he wins?" I said, and my voice, when I heard it, sounded smaller than I wanted it to. If the judge grants even a temporary emergency order, it can include an immediate freeze on your ability to act as trustee, pending a full hearing 30 to 60 days out. That would hand Ethan interim authority over the trust's voting rights during exactly the window when we most need you in control of them. It would not be permanent. But Eleanor, 30 to 60 days is more than enough time for a man this desperate to do a great deal of damage, and it would be considerably harder to undo than to prevent. I sat in my kitchen that evening and, for the first time since April, I let myself feel something close to real fear. Not fear of Ethan exactly, but fear of the machinery itself, of how quickly an ordinary Tuesday could become a courtroom in which strangers debated whether I was still the owner of my own mind. "What do we do?" I asked. "We fight it on the merits, immediately," Regina said. "I'm going to request an independent evaluation tonight, from a neuropsychiatrist the court itself has used before, someone with no connection to either side, so that whatever the judge sees isn't only Dr. Petroselli's opinion. I need you available tomorrow morning for that evaluation, and I need you rested if that's at all possible. I also need Frank pulling together every piece of evidence we have on the forged letter and the loan fraud, because if we can show the judge, even in preliminary form, that the person asking for guardianship has himself engaged in fraud against his mother, that changes the entire posture of this hearing." I did not sleep that night either. I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, the way I had sat at that same table 40 years earlier working out payroll for 6 employees by hand, and I wrote down, in my own handwriting, a timeline of the last decade. Every loan I had given Ethan. Every excuse. Every time I had told myself that helping him one more time was simply what a good mother did. I do not know why I felt the need to write it all down that particular night, except that I think some part of me understood that if a stranger in a black robe was going to sit in judgment of my mind the next morning, I wanted, more than anything, to be certain of it myself first. The independent evaluation took place the following morning in a quiet office 2 floors below Regina's. Dr. Simone Whitaker was a board-certified neuropsychiatrist in her early 50s, brisk and precise, who spent nearly 2 hours with me, testing memory, reasoning, judgment, orientation, the whole architecture of a mind laid out and measured the way an engineer measures the load-bearing capacity of a beam. She asked me to recall a list of 15 words, then asked me to name the president and the governor and the current date, then had me subtract backward from 100 by 7s, questions that felt almost insulting in their simplicity until I reminded myself that the entire point of the exercise was to be simple, to leave no room for doubt. "Tell me about your husband's company," she said, partway through, setting her clipboard down for a moment. "Not the numbers. Just tell me about it, in your own words." I found myself talking for several minutes, about the back room of the compounding pharmacy, about the year we nearly lost everything to a bad batch of raw material in 1991, about the recipe Thomas used for the coffee he made every morning before dawn for 11 straight years before we could afford to hire anyone else. Dr. Whitaker listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she nodded slowly. "Mrs. Marsh, I ask people to do that not because I need the history for my report, but because the way a person tells a long, complicated story tells me far more about the actual state of their mind than a word list ever could. You didn't lose the thread once. You didn't repeat yourself. You tracked 3 separate timelines without confusing them." She made a final note. I want to be direct with you, because I find people generally prefer that. There is no evidence here of any cognitive impairment. None. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning is sharp, your judgment, based on what I've observed today, is entirely intact. I will be submitting a report to that effect. Thank you, I said, and I felt something in my shoulders loosen for the first time in days. Don't thank me yet, she said, not unkindly. A report like this is powerful, but it isn't the whole hearing. The judge still has to weigh it against whatever the other side presents, and I understand the other physician's report characterizes some fairly specific incidents. That was the part that frightened me most, walking into the hearing 2 days later. Not whether I was, in fact, of sound mind. I knew that I was. What frightened me was the possibility that a stranger's account of incidents that had never happened, dressed up in the language of medicine, might sound more convincing to an unfamiliar judge than the truth sounded coming from a woman he had never met before that morning. The hearing was held in a small courtroom, nothing like the grand chambers people imagine from television, a plain room with fluorescent lighting and a judge named Harold Priestley who had, Regina told me quietly beforehand, a reputation for being unhurried and skeptical of exactly the kind of rushed emergency filings that Curtis Boyle had submitted on Ethan's behalf. Ethan sat across the room with Curtis Boyle beside him, and he did not look at me when I came in. I remember that most clearly. In every family gathering for the previous decade, whatever tension existed between us, my son had always at least looked at me when I entered a room. That morning, he stared at the table in front of him, and I understood, watching him, that some part of him already knew what he was doing was wrong, even as he pushed forward with it anyway. Curtis Boyle spoke first, describing, in broad and dramatic strokes, a woman in sudden and alarming decline, referencing Dr. Petrocelli's report, which cited, among other things, an incident in which I had allegedly become confused about the date during a phone call with Ethan, and another in which I had reportedly left a stove burner on overnight, an incident that had never occurred and that no one, I would later learn, could actually corroborate with any specificity. Judge Priestley listened without expression, the particular stillness of a man who has heard a great many exaggerated claims in his career and has learned to wait for the details before forming an opinion. Mr. Boyle, he said, when the attorney finished, your petition references a preliminary evaluation from a Dr. Petrocelli. Is Dr. Petrocelli present to testify today? He submitted a written report, Your Honor. I'm aware. I asked if he's present. He was unable to attend on short notice, Your Honor, given the emergency nature of the. Then I have a written report from a physician who examined Mrs. Marsh, as I understand it, for approximately 20 minutes, one time, at the request of her son, against a report I have here from Dr. Simone Whitaker, whom this court has retained as an independent evaluator on a number of occasions, who spent nearly 2 hours with Mrs. Marsh yesterday and found no evidence whatsoever of cognitive impairment. Judge Priestley looked up. Ms. Okafor, I understand you'd like to be heard. Yes, Your Honor. Regina rose. I'd like to enter into the record Dr. Whitaker's full evaluation, and I'd also like the court to be aware of a separate matter directly relevant to the credibility of this petition. In the course of preparing to respond to this filing, my client's counsel uncovered evidence that the petitioner, Mr. Ethan Marsh, forged his mother's signature on a letter used to fraudulently obtain over $200,000 in trade credit from a supplier in Georgia, and separately owes approximately $380,000 to an unlicensed lender in Nevada. We believe this financial desperation is the actual motivation behind this guardianship petition, not any genuine concern for Mrs. Marsh's well-being. The courtroom went very still. Curtis Boyle stood immediately. Your Honor, that is an extremely serious and entirely unsubstantiated allegation, raised for the first time in this hearing, and I'd ask that it be stricken. I have documentation, Your Honor, Regina said, calm and unhurried, and she laid the forged letter and the comparison signatures on the table in front of the bench, along with a summary of Caleb's findings. I'm not asking the court to rule on criminal matters today. I'm asking the court to consider that a petition alleging urgent concern for an elderly parent's welfare, filed by a man who appears to have forged that same parent's signature to defraud a third party months earlier, warrants considerably more scrutiny than an emergency ex parte proceeding typically allows. Judge Priestley studied the documents for a long moment, and then looked, for the first time, directly at Ethan. Mr. Marsh, he said, is that your mother's signature on this letter? Ethan did not answer immediately. I watched my son sit in a courtroom, under oath in every meaningful sense of the word, and search for a lie large enough to cover a truth that was already sitting on the judge's bench in black and white. I don't recall the specifics of that document, Your Honor, he said finally, and even Curtis Boyle, beside him, seemed to understand how badly that answer landed. Judge Priestley closed the folder in front of him. I'm denying the emergency petition. The evidence presented today does not come close to meeting the standard required for this court to strip a competent adult of her legal authority on an emergency basis, and frankly, Mr. Boyle, I'm troubled by how thin this filing was to begin with. If your client wishes to pursue a full guardianship hearing through the ordinary process, with proper notice and full evidentiary hearings, he retains that right, though given what's been raised today, I'd encourage him to think carefully about whether that's truly the path he wants to continue down. This matter is adjourned. I did not feel triumphant walking out of that courtroom. I felt, mostly, exhausted, and grateful, and deeply unsettled by how close we had come, by my own hand, to a very different outcome. Regina had been right about the mistake I had made with Dr. Vance. It had very nearly cost me everything Frank and Regina and Caleb had spent weeks quietly building. That should not have been as close as it was, Regina told me afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, her voice low. I want you to understand that clearly, Eleanor, not to frighten you, but because I think you need to see exactly how much danger you were actually in. If Dr. Whitaker's report hadn't come back as strongly as it did, if we hadn't had Caleb's documentation ready in time, this could have gone very differently. I understand, I said. I made a mistake. I told my doctor too much, at exactly the wrong moment. You made a human mistake, Regina said, gentler now. You were exhausted and frightened and you needed to say something true to someone. That's not a character flaw, Eleanor. It's simply a reminder that we can't control every variable, no matter how carefully we plan. What matters now is what we do with the time this bought us. That evening, I called Priya, because I needed, after everything, to hear a voice that had chosen honesty even when it cost her something. She answered on the first ring, the way she always did now. He filed for guardianship, she said, before I could speak. I found out an hour ago. He didn't tell me directly. I saw a text from Curtis Boyle on his phone confirming the hearing date. Her voice shook. Eleanor, is it true? What Regina said in court, about the forged letter. It's true, I said. I'm sorry you're learning it this way. There was a long silence, and when Priya spoke again, something in her voice had changed, hardened in a way I had not heard from her before. I have spent months making excuses for him, Eleanor. To myself, to my sister, to my own children when they ask why Daddy seems so tired all the time. I think some part of me has known, since the home equity loan, that whatever he was building wasn't honest. I just didn't want to be the one who said it first, because saying it first meant admitting my marriage was already over, even if the paperwork hadn't caught up yet. She took a breath. There's a folder. In his desk. I found it 3 weeks ago and I put it back because I was scared. I don't think I can keep pretending I didn't see it anymore. Priya, you don't have to decide anything tonight. I know, she said. But I think I already have. For the next several weeks, following that hearing, I did something that felt, at times, almost unbearable. I continued my ordinary life exactly as before, publicly, while privately the case against my son grew heavier by the day. I tended my garden. I read to children at the library on Tuesday afternoons. I had Ethan and Priya and the grandchildren to dinner on 2 occasions, strange, careful evenings in which Ethan behaved as though the courtroom had never happened, describing Meridian's supposed progress in vague and increasingly frantic terms, while Priya sat beside him and said very little, and I asked no pointed questions, and signed nothing, and let him believe, as Frank and Regina had counseled, that I remained exactly who he had always known me to be. It cost me something, that performance. At the second of those 2 dinners, in early June, Ethan sat at my table describing Meridian's progress with a confidence I now understood was purely theatrical, a distribution deal supposedly finalizing with a hospital network in Tennessee, numbers that existed nowhere except inside whatever story he was telling himself to survive the next few weeks. "It's going to change everything for us, Mom," he said, reaching for a second helping of the roast I had made, the same roast I had made him every June since he was a boy. "I know it's been a hard year. I know things have felt strained between us. But once this closes, I want you to see that I can actually build something on my own. Something you'd be proud of." I looked at my son across that table, and felt the full, aching weight of the lie sitting between us, his lie and, in its own smaller way, mine, both of us performing a version of a family dinner that had already ceased to exist. "I would be proud of you," I said carefully, "for building something honest, Ethan. That's the only kind of pride that's ever mattered to me. I hope you understand that, whatever happens next." "What's supposed to happen next?" he asked, a little too quickly, his fork pausing halfway to his plate. "Life," I said. "I only meant life, Ethan. Isn't that what any of us mean, when we say a thing like that?" Something flickered behind his eyes, there and gone, and for one unguarded second I thought he might actually hear what I was telling him underneath the words. Then he reached for the gravy, and the moment passed, and Priya, sitting silently beside him with her own plate barely touched, met my eyes across the table for just long enough that I understood she had heard exactly what I meant, even if her husband had not. I felt the particular loneliness of holding a truth too large and too painful to share with the one person sitting closest to me. The next major development came in the middle of June, and it came from a direction that connected, finally, every thread of what my son had been building. Arthur Ligotti, our chief executive at Marsh Whitcomb, called me on a Tuesday morning with a tone in his voice I had not heard from him in the 11 years he had run the company. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and please forgive me if this feels intrusive. Did you authorize any communication with a company called Meridian Health Distribution regarding a preliminary partnership or supply arrangement?" My stomach tightened, but my voice, when I answered, stayed level. "No, Arthur. I have never authorized anyone at Marsh Whitcomb to reach out to that company." "Why do you ask?" "Because our general counsel received a call yesterday from an attorney representing Ridgeline Solutions, the supplier out of Georgia, asking us to confirm the existence of a distribution partnership between Marsh Whitcomb and Meridian, referencing a letter apparently forwarded to them on our letterhead, purportedly authorized by you as trust chair." "Eleanor, no such letter originated from this office. Our general counsel is treating this as a potential forgery involving our corporate identity, and given that your name is attached to it, I wanted to speak with you directly before this goes any further." There it was, the thread of my son's fraud reaching backward into the company itself, no longer a private family matter but now, officially, a corporate legal exposure. I felt something close to relief mixed with a grief so sharp it nearly stole my breath, because I understood that this call meant the machinery of consequence had begun moving on its own, independent of anything I controlled, and there would be no gentle way to stop it now even if I had wanted to. Arthur, I said carefully, I need you to trust me for a few days without asking me to explain everything immediately. I am aware of this situation. I am working with legal counsel to address it. I need Marsh Whitcomb's general counsel to preserve every piece of correspondence related to this inquiry, and I need you to say nothing publicly or internally beyond what's necessary to protect the company's own liability. Can you do that? There was a pause, and then Arthur said, in the tone of a man who had known me for over a decade and had learned, in that time, not to underestimate my silences. Eleanor, whatever is happening, I trust you completely. You built the foundation this company still stands on. Whatever you need, you have it. And Eleanor, for what it's worth, I've worked with a great many people who tried to use your name for something you didn't authorize over the years. This is the first time I've ever seen someone try it who shared your last name. I'm sorry. That call told me something I had known intellectually for years but had never quite felt in my chest until that moment. The people who had worked alongside Thomas and me, who remembered what the company had been built from and understood exactly what my name still meant inside those walls, had not forgotten. My son believed he was maneuvering against a frail old woman who signed whatever was placed in front of her. He had no idea he was, in fact, maneuvering against the woman who still held, quietly, in a supervoting share class created the year we restructured the company for exactly this kind of contingency, the single vote required to approve or block any major transaction involving Marsh Whitcomb's assets, including any transaction with an outside distribution partner. I called Regina that afternoon and told her about Arthur's call. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that has stayed with me since. Eleanor, I think it's time to accelerate. After the failed guardianship petition, I believe Ethan is going to attempt something else soon, something with an audience, because he's already shown us he prefers a public moment where he controls the narrative to a quiet legal process where he doesn't. I want us prepared for that moment before it happens, not after. And I want Priya's information, whatever she's ready to give us, sooner rather than later. Priya called 2 days later, her voice steady in a way I had not heard before. I have it, she said. The folder. And Eleanor, it's worse than I told you. There's a sale agreement in there. For the lake cabin. Already drafted. She met me the next morning at a small coffee shop on Marymount Avenue, 3 blocks from where Ethan's second restaurant used to stand, a detail I don't think either of us mentioned out loud but that both of us noticed. She looked thinner than she had in June, her eyes ringed with the particular exhaustion of someone who has stopped sleeping through the night, and she set the folder on the table between us without preamble. I want you to know something before you look at it, she said. I've been carrying this for 3 weeks, and every single day I told myself I'd give it to you tomorrow. I kept thinking if I waited long enough, he'd come to his senses on his own, and I wouldn't have to be the one who ended it. You're not ending anything, Priya. He ended it, a long time before you found that folder. I know that. I do know that. Her hands were wrapped around a coffee cup she had not touched. But it still feels like betrayal, handing you evidence against my own husband. Even though I know exactly what he's done. Even though I've read every page in there twice. It still feels like betrayal. It isn't, I said. Betrayal is what he did to both of us. What you're doing is the opposite of that, even if it doesn't feel like it from where you're sitting. She was quiet for a moment, turning the cup in slow circles on the table. The children ask about him constantly. Where's Daddy? Why is he always on the phone? Why does he seem so tired? I don't know what I'm going to tell them when this is finally public. I don't know how you explain to a 7-year-old that their father forged his own mother's name. You don't have to explain all of it, I said. Not yet, and maybe not for years. You only have to tell them enough of the truth to match what they're old enough to carry, and add to it slowly, the way you'd add weight to a bridge you're testing. That's the only rule I know for something like this. Never lie to them. But you're allowed to decide how much truth fits on a given day. Priya nodded slowly, and something in her shoulders eased, just slightly, the particular relief of a person who has been given permission to do something imperfectly instead of perfectly. Thank you, she said. For not making me feel like I waited too long. You didn't wait too long, I said. You got here. That's what matters now. The call came from Ethan himself on a Thursday evening in late June, his voice warmer and more urgent than I had heard it in months, the voice of a man who believed, despite the courtroom, despite everything, that he still had one more move available to him. Mom, I want to have everyone over this weekend. The whole family. I've got some things I want to talk through, about the business, about the future, about taking care of you properly as you get older. I think it's time we all sat down together, as a family, and cleared the air. I felt the cold clarity settle over me again, the recognition of a trap finally closing into visible shape. Of course, I said. Where would you like to do this? The lake house, he said, and something in the way he said it, too casually, too carefully rehearsed, confirmed everything Regina had predicted. It feels right, doesn't it? All of us together, somewhere that matters to the family. He wanted the confrontation to happen on the very property he intended to sell out from under me, in front of witnesses he believed would side with him, in a setting designed to make refusal feel cruel and public exposure feel impossible. I understood, in that moment, that my son had learned something from me after all, even if he had learned it for the wrong purpose. He had learned to choose his battlefield. Sunday afternoon, I said. I'll be there. I called Regina and Frank the moment I hung up the phone, and Caleb, and finally Priya, who answered on the first ring as though she had been waiting for my call. He told me the same thing, she said quietly. A family gathering at the lake house. He asked me to make sure the children are there. Eleanor, I think whatever he's planning, he wants it to look like a celebration until it isn't. Priya, I said, I need to ask you something difficult. Are you prepared for what might happen to him, if what I believe about all of this turns out to be true? The silence on the line stretched long enough that I thought she might not answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was steadier than I expected. I've been prepared for a while now, Eleanor. I just didn't want to say it out loud until someone else said it first. Do what you need to do. I'll be there. And I'll bring something you might need. She did not tell me what, and I did not ask. I have learned, across 66 years, that sometimes the wisest thing you can do is trust the people who have chosen, at real cost to themselves, to stand where the truth is rather than where it would be easier to stand. Regina gathered all of us, Frank, Caleb, Priya, and myself, in her office on the Saturday evening before the gathering, the 5 of us seated around her conference table with the downtown lights coming on outside the window one by one as the sky darkened. I want to walk through this carefully, Regina said, because tomorrow is the moment Ethan chooses to make his stand, and I would rather we control the shape of it than react to it. Eleanor, you'll arrive as expected, alone, the way he'll anticipate. Frank, you're already an invited guest, which gives us a presence inside the room from the beginning without raising suspicion. Caleb, I want you nearby with the full documentation, ready if I need something pulled up quickly, but I don't want you inside during the opening minutes. Priya, this is the part one most want to be certain of. You do not have to be the one who produces that folder tomorrow. I can present everything we have without it. If you're not ready. I'm ready, Priya said, before Regina finished the sentence. I've been ready since the coffee shop. I just needed somewhere to put the readiness until it mattered. Frank reached over and squeezed her hand briefly, an old family friend's gesture, uncomplicated and warm. You're not going to be alone in that room tomorrow, he said. Whatever happens with Ethan, you have all of us. I know, Priya said, wiping her eyes with the back of her wrist and managing something close to a laugh. It's strange. A year ago I would have said my family was just Ethan and the kids. Somewhere in the middle of all this, it turned into all of you instead, and I'm not sure exactly when that happened, but I'm grateful for it. What if he brings Curtis Boyle? Caleb asked. After the hearing, wouldn't he want counsel there? He might, Regina said. It changes nothing about our approach if he does. If anything, having Boyle in the room works in our favor. A lawyer watching his own client contradict himself in front of the family, with a detective present, is a lawyer who very quickly starts advising his client to stop talking, which is exactly what we want Ethan to do once the evidence is on the table. And Detective Renner, I asked. You're confident he'll agree to be there? He's already agreed, Regina said. He reviewed the case file himself after the guardianship hearing and told me directly that he found the pattern deeply troubling. He'll be present as an observer, not to make an arrest tomorrow. That comes later, through the proper process. Tomorrow is about making sure Ethan's version of events cannot survive contact with what we actually have. I sat listening to all of it, the five of us around that table, and felt something I had not expected to feel after 6 months of fear and grief and sleepless nights. I felt, for the first time since April, something close to steadiness. Not because the outcome was certain. Regina had never once promised me certainty. But because I was no longer facing any of it alone in a kitchen at midnight, turning a forged letter over and over in my hands. I had built something else instead, quietly, the same way Thomas and I had once built a company from a back room, one honest relationship at a time. Thank you, I said, to all of them, and found I could not say much more than that without my voice catching, so I did not try. Sunday arrived warm and very still, the particular breathless quality of a Carolina summer afternoon before a storm. I drove out to the lake alone, past the turn my grandmother used to take too fast, past the dock my father had rebuilt 3 times across my childhood, and parked beside a row of cars that told me the whole family had already gathered. Ethan's brother-in-law was there, and 2 cousins, and Priya's sister, and, standing near the porch in a way that made my stomach tighten with recognition, a man in an expensive gray suit who did not belong among the flannel shirts and sunburned arms of a family lake gathering. Frank was already inside, seated quietly near the kitchen, having arrived 20 minutes earlier as an invited guest, a detail Ethan had not questioned, since Frank had been a family friend for 2 decades and his presence at gatherings had never before raised suspicion. Regina waited in a car parked discreetly down the private road, close enough to arrive within minutes, far enough to remain unseen until the moment mattered. Caleb sat on the porch steps with a laptop bag at his feet, and I saw him catch my eye and give the smallest possible nod. Ethan met me at the door with a warmth that would have fooled me completely 2 months earlier. He hugged me, told me I looked well, walked me inside with his hand at my elbow the way he used to when I was recovering from knee surgery years ago, a gesture of care that I now understood, watching it from the outside for the first time in my life, was also a performance, and a well-rehearsed one. At 2 o'clock, he gathered everyone in the main room, the wide windows behind him full of afternoon light off the lake, and cleared his throat in the particular way that told me he had practiced this moment more than once in front of a mirror. I want to thank everyone for coming, he began, his voice pitched warm and steady for the room. This isn't an easy conversation, but I love this family, and I've been carrying some concerns for a while now that I think everyone deserves to hear directly from me. He talked for several minutes about my age, my isolation since his father's death, small moments he described as concerning, a missed appointment, a misplaced set of keys, ordinary human forgetfulness reframed, sentence by sentence, into the careful architecture of decline. He did not mention the failed courtroom petition. I watched my nieces and nephews nod along, watched Priya's sister press a hand to her mouth, watched the family I loved absorb a version of me that had never actually existed. I've consulted with physicians, Ethan continued, and I've begun a process to protect Mom's assets and make sure she's cared for properly as she ages. This isn't about control. This is about love. Ethan, I said quietly, you already tried that process, 2 weeks ago, in a courtroom, and a judge denied it. His face went very still. That's not what this is. Isn't it? He reached the word love again, a second time, as though repeating it might undo what I had just said in front of everyone, and in that pause, Regina Okafor walked through the front door of the cabin my grandmother had built, wearing a plain navy suit and carrying nothing more dramatic than a leather portfolio, and the temperature of the room changed instantly. Mr. Marsh, she said, her voice calm and entirely without theater, my name is Regina Okafor. I represent your mother. I understand you attempted a guardianship petition 2 weeks ago, which was denied. I believe everyone in this room deserves the same clarity you were just offering them about your mother's supposed decline, so let's provide it properly. Ethan's face did something I had never seen it do before, a flicker of genuine fear breaking briefly through years of practiced confidence, therein controlled again almost instantly. This is a family conversation, he said. I don't think this is the appropriate setting. I agree it's an unusual setting, Regina said, but you chose it, Mr. Marsh. She opened the portfolio and, without raising her voice, without theatrics, began placing documents on the coffee table one at a time, the way I imagine a surgeon lays out instruments before a procedure, each one precise, each one necessary. The first was the letter sent to Ridgeline Solutions, my forged signature enlarged beside 6 authenticated samples of my actual signature, the discrepancies marked in red. This is a forged authorization, Regina said, used to obtain $210,000 in credit under false pretenses, fraudulently invoking Marsh Whitcomb Pharmaceuticals. This is a misunderstanding with a business partner, Ethan said quickly. That's being resolved. It's being resolved through a fraud complaint Ridgeline's attorney filed with the district attorney's office 2 days ago, Regina said, and I watched something in Ethan's shoulders drop half an inch. The second document was the Belhaven Capital loan, the ballooning interest rate highlighted, the current balance noted at the bottom. This is nearly $400,000 in debt to an unlicensed lender, incurred without your mother's knowledge, which appears to be the underlying motivation for everything that followed. That has nothing to do with any of you, Ethan said, his voice rising now. That's my business. It became your mother's business, Regina said, the moment you forged her name to service it. The third was the broad power of attorney Ethan had first brought to my kitchen table in April, the clause about diminished capacity underlined. This is the document your client attempted to have his mother sign in April, which would have given him control over her finances and her position as trustee of a company worth several $100 million, triggered by a medical determination made by physicians of his own choosing. A version of exactly that authority is what you attempted to obtain by emergency petition 2 weeks ago, using a report from a physician who examined your mother once, for 20 minutes, and did not appear in court to defend that report under questioning. Priya's sister had begun to cry quietly. My nephews had gone very still. Cousin Marcus, who had driven up from Greenville that morning and who had, 20 minutes earlier, been nodding solemnly along with Ethan's speech about decline and confusion, leaned forward and looked at the enlarged signature comparison for a long moment before he spoke. Ethan, he said, his voice carrying the particular disbelief of a man watching a cousin he had known his whole life become someone unrecognizable in real time, that he doesn't even close the same way. You can see it from here. Marcus, stay out of this, Ethan said. I drove 2 hours because you told me Aunt Eleanor needed her family around her, Marcus said. I'd like to understand what I actually drove here for. Ethan stood in the center of the room, his mouth slightly open, watching the careful architecture of the last 6 months come apart on a coffee table in front of everyone he loved. "This is a misunderstanding," he said again, and his voice had lost the practiced warmth entirely now, gone thin and fast. "Mom, tell them. Tell them I've only ever tried to help you." I looked at my son for a long moment. I thought of Thomas, and the stone I had carried in my shoe for 4 years, and the countless times I had told myself that giving Ethan more money, more grace, more benefit of the doubt, was simply what love required. I thought about the fact that love, when it is only ever given and never balanced by honesty, can become its own kind of harm. "I have helped you for 20 years, Ethan," I said, and my voice, when it came, surprised me with how steady it was. "I helped you through 3 failed businesses without ever once asking you to be honest with me about why they failed. I would have helped you again, if you had simply told me the truth about what you owed and to whom. Instead, you forged my name to defraud a stranger in Georgia. You put your own wife's house at risk without telling her the real reason. You told a judge I was losing my mind, using a doctor you paid, so that you could take control of everything your father and I built. That is not help, Ethan. That is theft, dressed up as concern, and I am done pretending otherwise for your comfort or mine." The room was utterly silent except for the lake outside the window, moving the way it always had, indifferent to everything happening inside these walls. It was Priya who moved next. She stepped forward from where she had been standing near the kitchen doorway, and she set something on the table beside Regina's documents, a manila folder she had been holding against her chest since the meeting began. "I found this 3 weeks ago," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "In your desk. I put it back, because I was scared of what it meant for us. I'm not scared anymore." Inside was the printout of the Beaver Lake parcel file, the photographs Ethan had taken of the cabin, and beneath them, a preliminary sale agreement drafted by the broker Vance Kessler, listing the property for $1.1 million, off-market, cash only, buyer identity withheld pending closing, a full $600,000 below the property's actual assessed value, structured exactly as Frank and Regina had predicted, for speed and concealment rather than fairness. "You were selling my grandmother's land," I said quietly, "without my knowledge, without my consent, to a buyer who didn't want their name on any public record. Where were you planning to send that money, Ethan? To Nevada? To whatever's left of Meridian?" He did not answer. He looked, instead, at Priya, and something passed between them that I will never fully know the shape of, 13 years of marriage collapsing in real time in front of 2 of his cousins and his own children's aunt. "You went through my desk," he said, and it was the only thing he said to her, quiet and wounded and, I noticed, entirely without any acknowledgement of what she had actually found there. "I went through our life, Ethan," Priya said. "And I found out you were willing to burn all of it down rather than tell me the truth. Twice. First with the house. Now with your mother." Detective Louis Renner, whom Regina had quietly arranged to be present as an observer given the potential criminal exposure involved, stepped forward from the porch where he had been waiting unobtrusively since before the family gathering began. He introduced himself calmly, showed his badge, and informed Ethan, in the flat procedural language of a man who had delivered this particular kind of news many times before, that given the evidence of forgery and fraud presented, along with the interstate nature of several of the transactions involved, both state and federal authorities would likely be initiating a formal investigation, and that he would strongly advise Ethan to retain independent legal counsel immediately. "You already have a lawyer, Mr. Marsh," Detective Renner added, glancing toward Curtis Boyle, who had gone very pale near the door. "Though given what I'm looking at on that table, you may want to consider whether he's the right one going forward." Ethan looked around the room one final time, at his cousins, his children's aunt, his wife, his mother, and I watched something in him finally understand, completely and without any remaining shelter of denial, that the structure he had spent 6 months building had just come down entirely, and there was no version of the afternoon left in which he walked out having won. "I never wanted it to go this far," he said, so quietly that I almost did not hear it, and for one brief moment, I saw, underneath everything, the boy who had painted a fence with me and gotten frosting on his face at 7 birthdays, and I let myself grieve him, right there in that room, even as I understood he had made every choice that brought him to it. He left without another word, taking nothing with him, and the sound of his car pulling away down the gravel road was, for a long time afterward, the only sound any of us could hear. The weeks that followed moved with the particular slow gravity of a legal process finding its proper shape. Caleb's forensic documentation, combined with Regina's filings, Ridgeline's own fraud complaint, and the record from the failed guardianship hearing, gave the district attorney's office more than enough to proceed. Federal investigators, drawn in by the interstate wire transfers connected to both the Belhaven loan and the attempted Meridian credit fraud, opened their own parallel inquiry. Ethan was arrested 6 weeks later, at his and Priya's home, on a Tuesday morning, in front of neighbors who would talk about it for months afterward in the careful, sympathetic, slightly thrilled way that neighbors always do. Priya called me that afternoon, her voice hollow with a grief that had nothing left in it of surprise. "They read him his rights on our own porch," she said. "In front of the children's swing set. I don't think I'll ever be able to look at that yard the same way again." "Tell me what happened," I said. "All of it, if you can." Detective Renner and another officer came at 8 in the morning. Ethan was still in his robe. I'd already sent the kids to school, thank God, so at least they didn't see it. Her voice wavered, then steadied. "He didn't fight it. He didn't argue, or ask questions, or even really seem surprised. He just stood there while they read him his rights, and at the end he looked over at me and said, 'Take care of the kids,' like that was going to be the last thing he ever needed to say to me. Like 13 years came down to 4 words on a porch." "What did you say back?" "Nothing," Priya said. "I couldn't get anything out. I just stood there and watched them put him in the car, and then I went inside and sat on the kitchen floor for a while, and then I called you, because I didn't know who else to call who would actually understand what I was feeling instead of just being shocked by it." "I understand it," I said. "More than I wish I did." "I keep waiting to feel relieved," she said, echoing, without knowing it, almost exactly what I had told Frank on my own porch weeks earlier. I thought once it actually happened, once the worst thing finally happened instead of just threatening to happen, I'd feel something like peace. I mostly just feel sick. "That will change," I said. "Not quickly, and not all at once. But it changes. I promise you that much, even if I can't promise you when." "I'm sorry," I said, and I was, more than I could easily explain, sorry for her, sorry for the children, sorry, even, for the parts of Ethan that had once been worth being sorry for. He eventually pleaded guilty to state charges of forgery and elder financial exploitation, and to a single federal count of wire fraud, in a consolidated plea agreement that spared everyone the ordeal of a full trial. The prosecutor, a measured woman named Denise Okoro who had handled elder exploitation cases for the better part of a decade, met briefly with Regina and me the week before sentencing. "I want you to understand what the plea agreement reflects," she said. "Your son cooperated fully once he retained legitimate counsel. He didn't contest the forensic evidence, didn't drag Ridgeline or the federal investigators through months of litigation, and provided a full accounting of the Belhaven debt, which actually helped us identify 2 other victims of that same lending operation in a separate jurisdiction. That cooperation matters, Mrs. Marsh, and it's reflected in the sentence we're recommending. I want you to know that isn't leniency for its own sake. It's because, in the end, he stopped lying once the lying stopped working." 2 other victims, I repeated. "Of Belhaven, or of him?" Of Belhaven, Denise said. I only mention it because I think it matters, going forward, that whatever else is true about your son, his cooperation did some good beyond your own family. That's not nothing, even in a case like this. I attended the sentencing hearing, in late autumn, in a courtroom not unlike the one where Judge Priestley had denied the guardianship petition months earlier. Ethan stood when his name was called, thinner than I had seen him even at the lake house, and when the judge asked if he wished to say anything before sentencing, he turned, briefly, toward where I sat. I know sorry doesn't undo any of it, he said, his voice unsteady. I'm not going to stand here and pretend it does. I made choices, and I knew, most of the time, that they were wrong choices, and I made them anyway because it felt easier than telling the truth about how badly I'd failed. I'm sorry, Mom. I don't expect that to mean much right now. I did not answer him in that courtroom. I am not certain, even now, exactly what I would have said if I had. The court sentenced him to 7 years, with mandatory restitution to both Ridgeline Solutions and to me, though I told Regina privately that I had little expectation of ever collecting a meaningful portion of it, and little real desire to try. Frank drove me home from the courthouse that afternoon, the two of us quiet for most of the ride, the Blue Ridge going gold and rust at the edges the way it does in late autumn. He pulled into my driveway and left the engine running for a moment before either of us moved. You did the right thing, Eleanor, he said. I want you to hear me say that plainly, because I don't think you're going to feel it for a while yet. Sometimes the right thing and the thing that feels good don't arrive on the same day. Sometimes they don't arrive in the same year. I keep waiting to feel something like relief, I said. Mostly I just feel tired. That's not unusual. You spent 6 months holding two things at once that most people never have to hold together. Loving him and stopping him. Most people only ever manage one or the other. He turned off the engine. Thomas would be proud of how you handled this. I know that's not my place to say, but I've known you both too long not to say it anyway. He'd have handled it better. He'd have seen it coming sooner. He might have, Frank said. Or he might have made exactly the mistakes you made, and forgiven himself for them exactly as slowly. Nobody gets to skip the part where it costs something, Eleanor. Not even Thomas. I sat with that for a while, in my own driveway, in the fading light, and something in my chest that had been clenched since April loosened, just slightly, enough to let me breathe all the way down for what felt like the first time in months. Priya's divorce was finalized 2 months after Ethan's arrest, and I have supported her through every part of that process, not because I stopped loving my son, but because I understood, finally and completely, that loving him honestly meant no longer protecting him from the consequences of who he had chosen to become. I visited Arthur at the Marsh Whitcomb offices one final time that winter, the first time I had set foot in the building in nearly 2 years. The lobby still had the same brass plaque near the entrance, Thomas's name and mine beneath it, founded in service of better and more honest medicine, a line Thomas had insisted on when we were far too small a company for such a grand sentence to mean anything, and that had somehow, 40 years later, come to mean exactly what he intended. Arthur met me at the elevator himself, rather than sending an assistant, which told me something about how seriously he had taken the last 6 months. The board wanted me to ask you something, he said, once we were seated in his office, and I told them I'd rather ask you directly than let it come through a formal letter. Given everything that's happened, would you consider taking a more active role again? Not day to day. But we'd value having you present at quarterly meetings. The people who remember what this company was built on are getting fewer every year, Eleanor, and I think it would matter to a lot of them to see you there. I thought about it for a long moment, looking past him at the window, at the ridge line beyond the parking lot that Thomas used to say looked, on a clear morning, exactly like the mountains behind the pharmacy where we'd started. I'll come to the spring meeting, I said. Not because I need to reclaim anything. I never lost it. But because I think you're right that it matters, for the people who remember, to see that the name on that plaque still means what it always meant. Arthur nodded, and for a moment neither of us said anything, the particular comfortable silence of two people who have weathered something difficult together and don't feel the need to narrate their way through the quiet after. For what it's worth, he said eventually, I never once doubted you, Eleanor. Not for a single day of this. I want you to know that. I know, I said. That mattered more than you probably realize. There were nights this year, Arthur, when I genuinely wondered whether I still knew how to trust anyone at all. You never gave me a reason to wonder that about you, not once, and I don't intend to forget it. You never gave anyone reason to doubt you either, he said. Whatever your son believed, the rest of us always knew exactly who we were dealing with. Regina made certain the fraudulent sale agreement for the lake cabin was voided entirely, and the land remains exactly where it has always been, 40 acres of pine and shoreline that will pass, when I am gone, directly to my grandchildren, held in a trust structure Frank and I built together the winter after that terrible Sunday, one that no single person will ever again have unilateral power to dismantle. I still live in the small cottage. I still drive the old Honda with the dented bumper. I still read to children at the library on Tuesday afternoons, and most of them have no idea, and never will, that the quiet gray-haired woman doing the voices for the wolf and the three little pigs is the same Eleanor Marsh whose name is carved into the cornerstone of a pharmaceutical company that employs 1,100 people across 3 states. Priya brings the children to see me most weekends now. Last month, my granddaughter, who is 9, asked me why I never told anyone how important I was. I thought about that question for a long moment before I answered her. Because being important was never the point, sweetheart, I said. Being honest was the point. The rest just turned out to matter, when it mattered. She did not entirely understand what I meant, and I did not expect her to, not yet. Priya sat beside me on the dock railing while the children waited in the shallows, and after a while she said, without looking at me, do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd just signed that first folder, back in April? The healthcare directive, or whatever he called it. I had thought about it, more than once, in the quiet hours when sleep would not come. I think about it, I admitted. I think if I had signed it, he might have stopped there. Or I think it might only have bought him a few more months before he needed something bigger, and by then there might not have been any evidence left to find, and no judge in the world would have believed a word I said against a report from a doctor he'd already paid. I don't know which version is true. I only know which version happened, and I've decided that has to be enough for me. Do you forgive him? It was the question I had been waiting for someone to ask me since the sentencing, and I found, when it finally came, that I already knew the answer, had known it for weeks without having the occasion to say it aloud. I forgive the boy who painted that fence with me the summer he turned 12, I said. I'm still deciding what to do with the man he became instead. I don't think those two things have to be resolved on the same day, Priya. I think you're allowed to hold both for as long as it takes. Priya nodded, and reached over, and took my hand the way she used to when she first married into this family, careful and a little uncertain, testing whether the gesture would be welcome. It was. Down at the water's edge, my granddaughter shrieked with laughter as her brother splashed her, and then went running, still laughing, down the length of the old dock at the lake house, toward water that had belonged to our family for 3 generations and would belong to hers for at least one more. I understood, sitting there in the warm Carolina light with Priya beside me, that whatever I had lost this past year, I had also finally set down something I had been carrying far too long, and that the quiet, ordinary life I had built for myself, the one my son had so badly misjudged, had turned out to be strong enough, in the end, to hold everything that truly mattered.